And
American healthcare is complicated and it doesn't work as well.
what? I've been linked this video like 3 times the past few days, and somebody's like, somebody in my subreddit really wanted me to watch this. 737 views.
As it possibly could. So I'm making this video to explain how the healthcare system works, how we can make it better. And I'm joined by a fantastic guest, Mr. King of the Coast. He is an economics student, and he actually studies healthcare policy for his job right now. My first question for you is, can you explain how the American health insurance system works?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Micah. And I want to say I'm privileged to be on the show with you today. So the first one is Medicare. So that's about 17%.
The best argument against anything having to do with U.S. healthcare is how unfathomably fucking complicated it is. Holy shit!
Of the population in the US. This is obviously the program for seniors. And one of the big misconceptions with Medicare is that it's purely government run. And it's actually not true. There's 2 different types of Medicare. There's traditional Medicare, which is run by the government.
And then there's like Medicare Part B, which I think is one of the big things that United Healthcare or whatever covers. It's this expansion to Medicare shit.
And then there is private Medicare, which are private plans that are run by outside health insurers like United Health. And right now, it's about 50-50 split between seniors in traditional Medicare and...
That's the Medicare Part... Oh, wait, Part C and Part D, is it? I don't know.
Seniors in Medicare Advantage.
There's a lot of people who say we should get rid of private insurance. We should have Medicare for all, right? We should all be on the same system that our grandparents were on. But they don't know that actually 51% of people that are over 65 and on Medicare are on a private Medicare Advantage plan. And basically the way it works is the government says, hey, you can either stick with traditional Medicare, that's what you start with, or you can swap for one of these private plans which are regulated and subsidized by the government. And a lot of people choose the Medicare Advantage plans because they offer more coverage for the same cost. So it's important to recognize that actual Medicare for all wouldn't look like a government having a monopoly on all insurance. Now, what is the next big government insurance program we should talk about?
The next program would be Medicaid and CHIP. And so these are really programs that aren't focused on the elderly. They're focused on the poor. Different from Medicare, they're not just solely financed federally. They're actually financed in this joint partnership between the states and the federal government. There's essentially a matching formula where if states put down money, the federal government will say, hey, we'll match it with this amount. And it tends to be higher if you're a poorer state. One thing that I think is also misunderstood about Medicaid is that most people in Medicaid are, again, in private plans. They are not in government-run plans. This is called Medicaid Managed Care. It's run very similarly to Medicare Advantage, where the government in the states will estimate, hey, what would this person cost based on their demographics and their health diagnoses in a government-run plan? We're going to give that lump sum to a private insurer, and then their job is supposedly to keep costs down without reducing quality.
Now, CHIP stands for Child Health Insurance Program. So it's interesting. Poor kids and poor adults are not always on the same program. Also, some people are ultimate government healthcare receivers. They're on Medicare and Medicaid. My grandmother, for instance, whenever she was dealing with her
the double whammy.
cancer treatments, was beneficiaries of both programs. Now, how does that happen? What happens because Medicare doesn't actually cover everything. There's still costs, there's still premiums, like it's not even free. And Medicaid actually...
Wait, is that true? There's premiums for Medicare? I didn't know that. Or does he mean there are things like co-pays and stuff? Because I think Medicare will have like co-pays. Like if you go to pick up a drug, you have to pay a little bit for like a drug that you pick up, I think.
What happens because Medicare doesn't actually cover everything. There's still costs, there's still premiums, like it's not even free. And Medicaid actually will make sure that they don't have to go pay for some extra private supplemental plan. They can just stack both on top of each other and most everything is paid for.
One thing to also note very briefly about Medicaid is that it has basically no premiums or cost sharing. And so contrary to what RFK Jr. thinks, that's actually like the standard.
Medicaid applies to people that with zero income, in many cases if they're disabled or they have kids. So charging a premium would be really hard. Now you can charge one that scales with income, which we try to do all the time, but it's really hard to determine people's income when they're at that low income because often they don't file taxes. So we really...
Medicare has about an 80% coverage with 20% after deductible, about $200 to $400 depending on the supply.
We don't know. It makes it more administratively complicated. So is there any other government health insurance programs that we should talk about? We talked about Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP already.
The next program that is related to government is going to be the individual market. And so we're not talking about the elderly. We're not talking about necessarily the poor as defined by Medicaid, but we're talking about people who are just kind of above the poor, generally unemployed. So they're not getting their insurance through their employer.
Or they work for a small business or they own their own business.
You can be both, but the general person is unemployed, I believe, and slightly above the income where they would qualify for Medicaid or their child would qualify for CHIP. So in this market, it's really what's known as managed competition. So what you have is these exchanges where a bunch of insurers come in and they're offering regulated products because we think this competition will be good. It'll keep down costs. It will drive up quality. And really the goal of this is to have a market where people who have still relatively low incomes can get insurance at an affordable price, especially if they already are sick, if they have a pre-existing condition. So these insurers aren't able to charge you anymore if you have, diabetes or if you already come to the market with cancer. They have to charge everyone the same. And this was actually the big change that was made to this market in, I think officially in 2014, but it's Obamacare.
That's called community rating. So you're not allowed to charge people different prices based on whether they have pre-existing conditions. Community rating, okay? You guys will learn some terminology. In order to fix that on the back end, they have this complicated risk adjustment system where they're subsidizing certain insurers and texting other insurers. It's a little bit complicated the ways in which they do it, but it's to make sure the playing field is level between them.
Do you know the government can garnish your Social Security checks to pay your student loans? I didn't know that. Apparently, a lot of seniors with old-ass student loans that go unpaused are being affected by it. Oh, yeah. The Social Security stuff can also be taxed as well. Like your Social Security paychecks are taxed, like income, too.
And the insurance, as you mentioned, are really regulated, right? They want to say it needs to cover all of these basic things, right? It needs to cover reproductive health care, it needs to cover your cancer screenings, yada, yada, yada. And the idea is, if we didn't have those regulations, well, consumers wouldn't actually read the long insurance documents to see every single thing that's covered. And so a lot of people would be ripped off. Now, there's stories about how that happened before these policies were put in place. So this is the marketplace where if you don't have a big employer, you're not old and you're not broke, you can get insurance. My mom has a job, for instance, and she is on the Affordable Care Act. So it's not a huge part of the healthcare system. I mean, it's less than, I think, 10%, right?
Oh, yeah, I meant to mention, it's I think it's actually around 3% in 2016. That might be a little dated now, but generally quite small.
I think it's higher now, but it is certainly not a huge thing. Most people are not on these. And keep in mind, there's 50 of these. There's different.
People are saying it's not taxed when you pay into it. So of course it's gonna be taxed when you take it out. Yeah, of course. But I'm partially providing that as a reason why they would probably tax it, or why your Social Security could probably be garnished. Like, of course you can garnish it. It's income, right? It's treated as income, basically. Yeah.
Different marketplaces in each state. Some states really like them, like California, and they subsidize them more, and they do all this stuff to make it more affordable for people. Some states really don't like them, so they don't.
There's literally no point to having advanced legendary heating pipes or whatever, right? They don't transfer heat faster. Okay.
They really have their own independent one. The federal government runs their one for them because like they're so not into it, and that's usually red states who are like, Obamacare, that sucks. I'm totally not interested in this. So that's something that you see. Now, one of the things that's important to understand about the system is there's a really complicated government subsidy for the premiums. The government subsidy basically caps your premiums, your monthly bill for this health insurance at a percentage of your income. And the percentage of your income they cap it at actually changes with your income. So as it gets higher, it gets capped at like 5% or 6%. If you're poor, it gets capped at like 2 or 3%. It will calculate this for you online, but that's what makes it really quite cheap for a lot of people. Folks that are on the lower income side can get their health insurance for a huge discount because the federal government is paying for most of it. Now, there is another government health insurance program that we did not mention yet, which is Veterans Affairs, which we should probably explain.
I think you should probably explain that one, honestly. I know less about it. But...
So the interesting thing about American healthcare is that we have all these different kinds of systems. Like Medicaid is like state sized single payer health insurance. Then Medicare is like sort of private competitive health insurance and sort of government health insurance. And then the individual marketplaces are totally private individual health insurance at the state level. And then the VA is socialized medicine. The government owns the hospitals and it owns the insurance. It manages the entire thing to provide health insurance for veterans. And so it's actually a really big program. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people which work at the VA. And another interesting thing is not everybody that's a veteran gets their healthcare from the VA. There's also TRICARE because, we said this system, our healthcare system isn't complicated enough. We need to have another alternative program for this system. And so that's exactly what we did. TRICARE works pretty similar to the other types of health insurance programs that we mentioned already. Now, this brings us to the big enchilada of health insurance, which is the employer-provided insurance market. What is that?
Yeah, so exactly like you said, this is the big enchilada. It's about 50% of the population in the U.S. is in employer. You'll hear it called group insurance. It's all the same thing, but these are people who get their insurance through their job. And the really important thing...
I'm trying to see why Destiny said it's so fucking complicated. Yeah, bro, like when I go to... Like I have no insurance, so theoretically, my hospital bills should be very simple. But like if I want to go and do labs, or say I want to go get a like STD test or whatever, I go to a hospital and I say like, hey, here are the battery of tests I want. Let's do this. And they're like, okay, what's the cost? They don't have insurance. Like, oh, well, since you don't have insurance, blah, blah, blah. Like this is what you have to pay. You pay today and you're good. Okay, cool. This has happened every single time. I've told the story a million times. I pay, I do my stuff. And then when I get home, eventually you get the results usually online. I'll have a bill that's mailed to me and I'll get a bill and I'll open it up. It's like, oh, ran a bill for $1,800 for a lab. So I'm like, okay. And then I'll call the hospital and I'll be like, hey, so you guys mail me a bill for this. Why? I don't know why. And they're like, oh, don't worry about that. Just ignore it. Sorry. I'm like, okay. And then at that point, I'll either get another piece of mail that'll say, here's your new balance is $0, or I'll get another piece of mail that says your balance is actually $400. And then I'll call them again and be like, hey, do I need to pay this? And they're like, oh, no, sorry, don't worry about that. And then I'll get another one saying that it's $0. It's just like, and this is for somebody with, I have no insurance, I just pay cash, okay? Tell me what to pay and I'll pay you. I don't care. Boom. And it's still like absurd. Everything about healthcare in the United States is absurdly fucking complicated. Or like when I go to buy my Vyvanse, every time I go to buy my Vyvanse, because I'm a cash paying customer, they're always like, are you sure? It's really expensive. It's like, I know. Because it's like, I think I pay $1,300 to pick up 3 months worth. So they're like, well, hold on. Why don't you get a coupon first? So they have a phone sitting there, and then you pick up the phone, and then you type in your prescription, and you look on some website called the Good RX or whatever, and then you see if there's a coupon available, and you're like, okay, here's a random coupon. And they're like, cool, let's scan that. And for Vyvanse, it's like, you say like $5 if you're getting the brand name. And they're like, okay, cool. And it's like, what is the purpose of what are we doing right now? Why are you giving me a phone to scan for a coupon that I don't like reasonably have to like and this is for somebody with no insurance. So theoretically, my bill should be the easiest, not the cheapest. It should be the easiest to understand, the simplest to do. But it's just like, oh my God, it's actually so unfathomably fucking complicated navigating the U.S. healthcare system. It's cancer AIDS.
To understand about employer insurance is it's not necessarily this, just natural thing that emerged, but it's instead subsidized by the government indirectly through a tax deduction.
How the fuck do you get 3-month prescription? I can't get more than a month. I told my doctor that I abuse downers like crazy, that I like oxy, I like heroin, I do perks. And he's like, really? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, okay, so you probably don't abuse uppers at all, right? I'm like, no, never. And he's like, okay. And then he gave me 3 months. Got him.
So if your employer decides to pay you $100 and they do it in what we call wages.
Why don't you just get insurance? I'll set it up probably next year with my company, I guess. I just have to, it's a whole thing.
Through a tax deduction. So if your employer decides to pay you $100 and they do it in what we call wages, they have to pay a tax on it. Whereas if they do it in the form of health benefits, that can actually pay no tax. And so this on the margin is incentivizing employers to give you health benefits instead of, your normal salary. And so you end up with this, really huge market for people who are under 65 where they're getting their insurance through their job. And the actual kind of weird thing about this is it's technically called a market, but it's only a market from the perspective of the employer who's getting to go out and select the plan. So most employers have a single plan that they're offering to everybody. I think one really important thing to understand about this market is there's a big move to something called self-funding. So this is about, I think 65% of people who have employer insurance now are on a self-funded plan. And what this means in very simple terms is that instead of the employer paying a premium to an insurer, and that insurer will then, pay out all the claims when people at this company get sick, it's instead the employer is collecting premiums. They're paying a fee, it's not really a premium, to the plan to have them go out and do all the negotiating with the providers and whatever.
They're basically the insurance company, but they're outsourcing their negotiations to an actual insurance company, right?
Yeah, so they're taking on the financial...
The amount of like secondary markets and shit that exist relating to insurance is actually just so cringe AIDS.
Risk instead of the actual insurer. And you might think, why is that happening? Does that even really make any sense? You think the insurer would prefer to do that? It might be better. And there's actually a pretty simple reason for it, which is that if you don't self-fund your plan, if you pay premiums to an insurer and they take on the financial risk, you have to comply with a bunch of these different coverage mandates. So these are like what Micah talked about in the individual market with the essential health benefits that all plans need to cover. It's a very similar thing for more typical employer insurance. But if you self-fund, you don't need to do this. And you can basically design essentially like whatever plan you want. So I know, for example, a couple people who have, through their employer insurance, really liberal access to Ozempic and other related drugs. And this is much more liberal access relative to a program like Medicare or Medicaid.
They're just throwing Ozempic at everyone.
Yeah, where they almost treat it almost like preventative care, because in those other markets, you really need to have a certain diagnosis to get it, and it's kind of a pain. So there is kind of unprecedented flexibility in the employer market, even though it's not a real market. What would you guys say to that?
Yeah. First, to understand why some people get their health insurance from employer-provided insurance, as King of the Coast said, it's subsidized because you don't have to pay taxes on it. Do I want to give you money, which I have to pay taxes on, you have to pay taxes on, then you have to pay income taxes on, or do I want to give you health insurance, no taxes? Well, I want to give you health insurance. But also there's a mandate. If you have over 50 employees, guess what? The government says you have to provide people insurance. This is something that came from Obamacare. Now, some employers try to get around this by having tons of private contractors. They say, yeah, you work here 40 hours a week, yada, yada, yada. But you're not an employee. You're just a private contractor, which happens to work here for a very long period of time. And so they're able to get out of providing you insurance. But that's problematic.
Wait, Dan told me this. I don't know if he's lying or not. Is it true that in California, Uber and them lost their case and you actually have to W-2 like Uber drivers and DoorDash and shit? Does that even exist in California anymore?
In its own ways. Now, you mentioned these self-funded plans. Few people understand how this works. I like that you explain it, because not only do they get way more flexibility, some employers do some pretty cool stuff with this, but also they don't have to deal with the profit margin, right, that the insurance takes. The insurance, they're giving you this thing, huge scale, right? We're going to protect you from risk. So we're going to take some profits here. It's 3, 4, 5, 6%. If you're a huge employer, like you're Amazon, well, guess what? You're so big, you don't need somebody to protect you from risk.
And Destiny, real question. What do you think of the idea of a young, healthy, wealthy person in your position getting insurance as a way to help lower costs by paying in and not taking out as an ought? Yeah, I think that's the only way insurance works. This is why the mandate was so important for the Affordable Care Act, but the Trump admin killed the mandate, so rip.
We're as big as the insurance companies. And so you can say, well, we're not going to have y'all do this. We're going to do it ourselves. We're going to save some money in the process, and we're going to do this creative, whatever we want stuff. And so it actually makes a lot of sense for the really, really, really big guys. Now, one of the arguments people make for employer-provided insurance is, since the bigger the employer is, the more bargaining power they have to get a better deal for their employees. So there's an idea here that, if we all paid for insurance individually, we would get worse deals because we have less bargaining power. We'll get to what we think about that in the future. So this is the insurance system. Is there anything about health insurance that we missed?
Yes, there's one other system that is not, I don't know if you technically call it a system, but it is the almost uninsured market in the US. So this is about 10% of Americans who don't have any health insurance technically. And so what we do with them is because they're not technically on a plan, who don't have an insured market in the US. So this is about 10% of Americans who don't have any health insurance technically. And so what we do with them is because they're not technically on a plan, we don't just leave them out to dry necessarily. Instead, what we do is we subsidize a lot of care. This is from both the federal government and state governments.
Hell yeah, I'm getting subsidized? I didn't even know that. Subsidize me, baby.
We subsidize care to be provided to people who are uninsured. And depending on how exactly low your income is when you're uninsured, that hospital care may end up being free. It may end up being reduced price. And a lot of times, like a lot of the time, it is care that the hospital is providing to you as an uninsured person. And then they're putting you on a payment plan where you will, over time, supposedly pay back the hospital for the care.
Yeah, a lot of people certainly don't pay back. I mean, there's community healthcare centers and nonprofits which just provide healthcare for free to people. It's a real patchwork of system. And we have a lot of uncompensated care in this country where the doctor's offices and the hospitals provide the care, but they don't ever really get paid for it, which that either the government has to try to subsidize on the back end to pay for it, or that they charge higher prices to everybody else to offset the costs. So that's definitely a big thing. There's also like unregulated private individual insurance, which used to be much more frequent. It still happens. These plans are often scams. They're pretty bad. The kind of people who purchase them are not necessarily the most scrupulous of people, right? They're like, oh, I don't have health insurance. I saw this advertisement for Joe Blow's health insurance company. Okay, well, Joe seems like a nice guy. I'm going to buy it. It's not a huge number of people that are on these plans, but they're known for not being the best. So that covers how health insurance works. If there's any takeaways that you should have, it is that we have literally tried everything, and we have the most fragmented healthcare system in the entire world. The rest of the world usually just chooses one thing. Maybe if they're feeling really special, they choose two things. They're like, we're going to have a government system and this private system. But America, we said we can't decide. So we're going to choose everything, and we're going to choose it multiple times for different people. And that has some adverse consequences. Let's transition to some of the commonly cited problems about our healthcare system so that we can explain which ones are true, which ones are false, and then we can get to some problems that people don't really cite that actually are genuinely a big issue that we should address. Which problem should we start with?
So the first problem we need to talk about is the big one, and this is the problem that the U.S. spends about twice as much.
What is your opinion in the most favored nation drug pricing bullshit Trump has been talking about? It's dumb, but it's complicated economic reasons to explain why it's dumb, and I'm tired of explaining it, so suck my dick.
As other developed countries on healthcare. And this is really like a commonly cited problem, but I think, and I think Micah thinks as well, this problem is very misunderstood. So it is true that the US spends a lot more than other countries, especially European countries. But the thing to understand is that healthcare is a consumption good. And ultimately, people's capacity to consume consumption goods is downstream of whatever their income is. And why is that important? The fact of the matter is that the US has a lot higher household incomes than all of these other countries where people compare us to. And so when you think about it in that lens, it's actually pretty natural. You would think that the US would spend a lot more on healthcare because the households here are actually richer. This isn't necessarily just speculation either. You see, if you look in the cross-section of countries, that there's a really strong correlation between the household incomes of the nation, the average household incomes, and average healthcare spending. And it's not just necessarily in the cross-section either. If you look over time, what you'll see is that basically every country is following the US trajectory of healthcare spending as they get richer. And so this suggests that there's something going on where as people get richer, as they're already satisfying their really basic necessities, so they've got food, they've got housing, whatever, on the margin, what they're spending that additional dollar on is their health. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think something that illustrates the point that you're making is the second most expensive healthcare system in the OECD, the developed countries, is Switzerland. Why? Is it just because the Swiss people are like uniquely inefficient and unscrupulous with their public healthcare systems as we are? No, it's because they're richer than everybody else, right? Like there is, we'll put up a picture of this, but you see there is a really strong relationship, as you mentioned, over time. People get richer, they spend more on healthcare. True. And amongst countries, the richer a country is, turns out usually the more they spend on healthcare. There are some exceptions to this. For instance, in Hong Kong and Singapore, very rich areas, they don't spend very much on healthcare.
Yeah, no, that is a good point. And I think
I'm behind, but with response to the idea of a vacancy tax, even if it's only a little bit effective, if there are no downsides, then it seems like it's a good idea. Not that I'm saying that there are downsides. I don't even want to grant the question. The answer is yeah, it's a good idea. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But the problem is people will do this expecting that this is going to make a significant dent. The problem is not. Like people are just obsessed over this, the myth that there are all these empty homes that all these corporations or billionaires are sitting on. So I almost don't even want to grant the answer. But I mean, the answer is yeah. I mean, there's no downside to it. You might as well. Vacancy taxes, I think a vacancy tax is totally fine because you don't want land sitting there unused. I think that's bad. It's just not going to make a significant dent in your housing markets.
I don't fully understand why that is, but I think one story you could tell is that those areas are kind of uniquely suppressing the demand for healthcare in a way that these other countries aren't able to. I don't know if you have.
I think they also introduce a lot of technology to reduce costs. Is if you look at in a place like Singapore, we'll evaluate this more later. The actual prices they pay for the healthcare are really remarkably low, like just a fraction of the amount that we pay here, which is interesting because you can imagine in Morocco they pay a lot less for healthcare than we do because they're poor, right? So the wages are low, so it's just cheaper to do stuff. In Singapore, the wages are high; they're like as high as here, but their healthcare costs are so lower. Why? Because they use a lot more technology, from my understanding. They use more efficient practices, so they use that labor, they ration it more efficiently. And so this is the reason why healthcare costs go up with income is for really two main reasons. First, you spend more on stuff, right? You're just like, I want more healthcare because, what else am I going to spend all this money on? I want to stay alive, right? Like, especially late life care, you're like, man, if I have cancer or something, like, I'm going to throw everything I got at it because what are you going to do? You're going to say, okay, I'm going to choose between buying more TVs and buying more healthcare.
There's no downside. What about in Nebraska where half the people have left? First, I don't think half the people left Nebraska. But secondly, what do you mean? Then sell your fucking home. Don't just hold on to it. Stop being a home hoarder, okay?
I mean, if you have the extra income and you're housed and you're fed and whatever, you're going to throw the money at cancer, right? Like you are going to try to solve your chronic condition or illness or disease. Just people.
What percentage of homes would have to be vacant for you to say it's a problem worth addressing? I don't know. You can address it if you want. It doesn't have to just be one thing. I don't know where this weird obsession comes from. You can address lots of problems. It's not a significant issue in any housing market that I've ever seen. I haven't seen that demonstrated ever. Your vacancies tend to be highest in markets that have the least amount of demand.
Consume more healthcare in rich countries, but also
like I don't even know, just functionally, I don't know if that would ever even be a problem worth addressing because there's just typically not much incentive to have a vacant property. Like you're losing money by just having a property sit there and having it be vacant.
Wages are higher, even if the workers are more productive. Wages have to be higher because the total wage rate at the economy-wide level is growing, and so wages in all sectors have to grow at the same rate or a similar rate to keep up. And that's why going to a doctor, a physician in the United States is more expensive today than it's ever been before. And next year, it will be more expensive than it ever was previously because as wages grow, that means wages even in healthcare are growing. So it's going to get more and more expensive. Since we have higher wages here, naturally, just providing healthcare will be more expensive, even if it's the same amount of healthcare. So that's cost. Some of the degree of difference in American healthcare spending in other countries is over-exaggerated, but there are components that contribute to it that many people make allegations about that we want to explain. Why don't we start first with drug prices? We pay much higher drug prices than the rest of the world. This leads us to spending more on drugs. Does that explain all of the difference in our healthcare spending on drugs versus other countries? And also, is our extra healthcare spending on drugs justified or can it just be reduced without any negative consequences?
So my understanding is that just more generally, you can't really explain the entirety of these differences in spending in terms of prices.
People don't want to deal with the headache of being a landlord. Why rent things out and have to hire a property manager when you can sit on it and flip it or sell it years down the line? Because you're losing money doing that. There's so many better ways to make money. You're just flushing money down the drain. Some people might be retarded enough to do that, but it's just a waste of money.
So the OECD has price indexes that are obviously going to be imperfect, but they suggest that about 50% of higher healthcare spending in the US is due to quantities and about 50% is due to higher prices. And importantly, when we say higher prices, that doesn't necessarily mean you're just paying more for less. It could also mean higher prices are representing higher quality. That's obviously a claim. I'm not saying it's correct across the board. And it could also just represent the
I love my B-roll.
intensity of the care you're getting. So this is a concept where you might think of the quantity measure as a hospital stay, but what you're actually getting within a given hospital stay, that's the
Wouldn't a vacancy tax discourage new units from being built for the fear of them going vacant? One, no, because if you're building in like high occupancy markets, you probably shouldn't have very many vacancies. Two, vacancy taxes, I think usually only apply if it's been vacant for like more than 6 months or whatever. And three, no, I think that's a good pressure. You should want people to be worried about their units being vacant. It would probably encourage people to lower prices if they can't rent a unit. It shouldn't just be, I'm going to keep this high until somebody shows up. Like those market forces should be active, I think. But
intensity.
I don't think it would be that big of a deal.
And so if you were looking at a price index across countries of hospital stays, what you'd see is that the price is a lot higher in these richer countries that deliver more intense care. So that's just the first point, is that it's not, in general, prices probably cannot explain these cross-country differences. But specifically now moving to drug prices, we do pay much higher drug prices than other countries. And this is by, I wouldn't necessarily say proponents, but by like acceptors as being just the price we pay for innovation. So the argument is that these companies are putting huge amounts of money into R&D up front. They're failing a lot when they try to develop these drugs. And what we're doing is we're letting them make a ton of money on these blockbuster drugs that end up getting through FDA approval and doing really well. And that's paying off for all their failures that they had down the road. But importantly, other countries are not doing this.
They're doing price controls, right? So they're saying, sorry, we're going to pay you a much, much, much lower amount, which means that if we charge the same prices as those other countries, a lot of those drugs actually wouldn't be profitable to invest in the first place.
Yeah. So in technical...
Would the problem be most land is underutilized, like in Southern California cities? Over 90% of the residential units are single family? Maybe, but that's not an economic problem. I mean, it leads to an economic problem, but that's a cultural thing. Like in the United States of America, a lot of people want houses. They'd rather have a single family house than live in an apartment. Apartment is seen as like being a poor person if you live in an apartment. Like a lot of Americans still have that view.
Econ jargon. What other countries are doing is something called marginal cost pricing. So they're essentially putting the price of these drugs at the point where once they've already been developed, the manufacturer would keep producing and selling them. But the price is so low that it wouldn't actually compensate them for all the upfront development costs that they incurred. And we Americans are the ones who are paying for those costs. That is at least the argument made by people who say we shouldn't, or we should at least accept high drug prices and not try to bring them down.
Right. In other words, they're free riders off of America. Now, we do see that whenever America takes actions to reduce drug prices, which we've used government bargaining power to bring down the costs, there is a huge R&D response. And this is seen really everywhere. So there's really no dispute. If you bring down drug prices, guess what? The pharmaceutical companies are not investing in drug innovation because they care about us, or they're like, I really want to solve cancer. They're mostly trying to make money. So if you bring down the amount of money that they can make from different drugs, well, guess what? They're going to invest in less drugs, less new ones. And that has consequences. So it is true. We could reduce American healthcare spending by hundreds of billions of dollars, probably, if we just did the same kind of price controls the rest of the world has. But there is an actual impact that has on healthcare innovation. Now, some people say we should do the price controls and then we should have the government fund all of the R&D and whatever, and that would actually be cheaper because these companies take really high margins. Totally possible. But just know that we don't just charge higher prices for the same drugs without any sort of benefits of that. Moving on to another issue that people frequently cite, administrative costs. Is American healthcare significantly more expensive than the rest of the world's because of administrative costs?
So this is actually a pretty debated claim. It was, I think, about a month ago, making the rounds on Twitter, where you had, I think, Matt Yglesias and Eric Levitz and Noah Smith all arguing that, administrative costs actually aren't that big a deal for American healthcare. And then you had Matt Brunig coming in and saying, that's just looking at the insurer's administrative costs. You got to think about all the administrative costs on the provider side. So all the hassle that the doctors have to deal with complying with different plans. So I think it's unclear how much of the cost discrepancy is due to administrative costs, but a fact that is 100% true is that we have higher administrative costs in the US than we would have under a single payer system where we moved everybody from the many different plans that they're on to traditional Medicare. Is there anything you want to add on that before?
For two reasons, right? First, the insurers have their own overhead. They have tons of employees. If you know anybody who works for an insurance company, guess what? Well, they probably would lose their job because the government, to scale up Medicare, you don't need that many more employees. You just don't. So it's a lot simpler for them, insurance side. But also, it is a lot simpler on the provider side to not have to negotiate with tons of different people all the time, not have to facilitate claims and payments to all these different people. In America, not only do we have all these different insurers and all these different providers, but we also have all these different payment systems, these like middleman intermediaries, which facilitate these transactions. Sometimes there's multiple middlemen just for a simple transaction. There's also pharmaceutical benefits managers, which are in the mix. So it is 100% true that if you cut down on these middlemen and you try to simplify the administrative processes for the providers and the health insurers, you could reduce costs. The estimates on this range, but McKinsey and company did an estimate and they found it was hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of savings that you could generate, which means that it is worthwhile to at least look into. Certainly, if you know any physicians or doctors or people that work in healthcare, they will whine about administrative costs. So there is something that this talking point is getting at. Now, another talking point that is frequently floated is that America pays its doctors a lot more than the rest of the world. This is true, actually. If you look at the ratio of physician wages to like the normal median wage in the country, America pays a much higher multiple to our physicians. Our physicians are top 5%, sometimes top 1% based on the specialty. In other countries, being a physician doesn't make you that much wealthier than everyone else. Certainly, you're not getting paid what a janitor is getting paid. But the degree of position in the wage distribution is more notable for physicians in the United States. Why is that? And is that an avoidable problem that we have?
Well, I would actually add a little bit of nuance to that claim, Micah,
Okay.
and say that it is 100% true that relative to the median wage, doctors in the US are making way more than doctors relative to the median wage in other countries. However, that is probably more just a reflection of greater wage inequality in the United States. So just in general, high-skilled occupations in the US are making a lot more, or at least you might call them highly educated occupations, are just making way more than the median wage than they are allowed to make in other countries. And so if you were actually to compare the wage of the average doctor, for example, to the wage of other people in like the top 5% of earners, what you find is that relative to those top 5% of earners, I think doctors in the US make like 1.5 times as much, 1.3 times as much. And that is on par with what doctors make relative to the very top earners in other countries. So if you think of those other occupations as kind of the outside option for really smart people who are going to go into medicine and take all this time training, going to school, doing the residency. So it's a really like long time where you're not making any money. You might think that relative to those occupations that are also high paying, U.S. doctors may not actually be over.
So it really is about what your benchmark is, right? So there's one view, which is the one that you're expressing right now, which is there's really only a very small percentage of the population, the most intelligent, the most hardworking people that can be doctors to a sufficient degree. And so we need to pay wages that are competitive for the other professions they're choosing between for it to make sense, right? You can't just lower doctor wages and then now there's not enough high-skilled people going into sector. There's another view, which is really actually, there's a lot of people that could be doctors that are reasonably intelligent enough, that could be educated enough to be doctors. And so we don't need to just compare doctors to like the highest skill, highest wage people. Like you're either a doctor or an investment banker. You can compare it to a lot of other, like a much broader swath of the population, maybe the top 30% or the top 40%. And that's the better.
Could there be a situation where you own a 100-unit apartment, but you decide to rent out 75 units, keep 25 vacant to create an artificial shortage and charge higher rent while reducing maintenance? You would have to corner like the entire rental market to do that, because I imagine that would just be 25% of your income just lost. That's so much money you would lose out on. You'd have to be able to charge such a higher premium, and you'd have to hope that there aren't other people that can compete with you in the market on rent.
Framework of comparison. I'm personally probably in the latter camp. I think that there's certainly, doctors should be sharp and intelligent and smart. But I don't think that it's a profession that requires such a high degree of knowledge and intelligence and natural skill that it only applies to like the top 5% of most skilled, richest workers. I don't think that, you either are a CEO or a doctor, and that's the kind of competition that we have. Now, people often mention what part of the explanation for why doctor wages are supposed to be so much higher in the United States is how much harder it is to become a doctor in the United States. Do you think there's any sort of truth to that? And can you kind of outline how our process is more complicated than other countries?
Yeah, so I would say there's some truth to that. How the process works here, which is different than other countries, is that you have to spend 4 years in undergrad, and then you do your 4 years in med school, and then you do your residency, which I think depending on the specialty that you go into can be like 3 to 8 years. Feel free to correct me on that. But that's a very long process when you put it all together. And if you compare it to other countries, what they end up doing is something closer to like 6 years of education pre-residency. A lot of that is, I think they cut the undergrad portion to about 2 years, and then you do
one program,
like the 3 to 4 years of med school. Yeah, and exactly, it's bundled into one program. And so they can become doctors way faster than you can really become a doctor in the US. Why exactly that is the case is, I think, an interesting question. Because as it stands, no one is technically stopping like hospitals from hiring doctors that went to 6-year combined undergrad med school degrees. So it's an interesting question of why they haven't actually taken off in the US, but I agree that's definitely a portion of why.
It used to be a thing, I believe, where you didn't need undergrad to go to medical school, and then it became a thing. It's the same thing with law school, actually. I know this is the case for law school, because law school, you could just go get your bachelor's of law, and then they changed it where it had to be a graduate degree.
I have no idea why Actually, I don't know for medicine either. I don't know why for law or for medicine, why you would have to have an undergrad before going to the specialty school. That seems really weird. Other than like those professions just artificially protecting themselves.
And there was professional groups which wanted the process to be longer so that they could get paid more, because there's fewer people that end up completing the process. The harder the process is, the fewer people that complete it, which means the higher the wages for those that do. Now, another difference is that we have to pay to go to medical school. A lot of other countries, it's free, it's subsidized. Maybe you even get a stipend for going. My God. And we have a scarcity of seats. So we actually have less physicians per capita than most other countries, except for Japan and South Korea. And that is a function of us having less residencies and us having less medical school seats. Everybody knows people that were really smart, that worked very hard, that studied for the MCAT for a very long time, and they didn't get into medical school. So the difficulty of getting into medical school is a part of the strenuousness, which contributes to the wage premium. But also, there just is like a bottleneck, which is the supply of seats and the supply of residencies. And this happens because it's not actually a market for the supply of seats. Like, it's not moving with supply and demand, actually. The acceptance rate for these schools is constantly and consistently dropping. And we had a moratorium, actually, on medical school seat expansions for about like 20 years because we thought we were going to have a doctor oversupply. So there is like actual government and a nonprofit ecosystem that has led to a real difference in the demand for going to medical school and the supply of actual institutions and seats available to those people to actually complete that training process.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add on, you brought up residency. I think it's important to understand how residency is financed in the US, which might help people understand why there might not be enough seats. But for the most part, if you're doing a residency in the US, like my dad, he's a surgeon, they're doing a Medicare finance residency. So their hospital that they're training at is getting money from normally the federal government, but also state Medicaid programs to essentially cover their salary while they train. And the argument from the hospitals is that, if you have an established attending physician, so that's the head physician, their workload's going to get all clogged up by having to train all these newbies. And so they need to be compensated for that. And just paying the trainees basically nothing is not enough. Nobody would want to come into medicine. That's their argument. So a lot of residencies are funded this way, but there's also an important other sector of residencies that is funded directly by the hospitals. And how this works is they really just offer to train these incoming hopeful physicians in exchange for paying them really, really low wages. Like my dad, I remember, was making about like the same amount of money as my mom when he was training. And my mom at that time was like an elementary school teacher. So you're really not making a lot of money during the training process. And the hospitals justify this by saying it is costly to train people. And so if you want to get more people through residency, it's probably true that you have to subsidize it. But there's a question about whether there's really a bottleneck in like a certain kind of like government sense of blocking new residents, or there are just like not enough people who want to work at what the market wage would be? What would you say?
Well, I think the bottleneck is more when it comes to medical school seats because there's accreditation. So actually entry, starting a new medical school, even expanding medical schools is not a straightforward process. There is a lot of different government entities that allow physicians groups to have veto points to reduce expansion of the actual supply of training physicians. But in short, it is probably true that healthcare physician wages could be lower, which means healthcare could be cheaper. And the reason why we pay them more here than other places is it's hard to go through the process. The process is more expensive because people themselves pay for it. It is longer. And there's also some bottlenecks, right? It is like the supply and demand of medical school seats is not moving like a normal market where more people want to go to medical school and bam, now there's more seats available for them. Now, that's enough time on that. So there's one other thing that I think we should address before we cap off this expensive cost section. Let's talk a little bit about volumes, right? And quality. So people understand what Americans are actually paying for and the differences between what we pay for here and other places. We mentioned drugs earlier. Americans have access to newer drugs than other people. We also consume more drugs than other places. So we consume a higher volume of drugs. And they're disproportionately newer drugs than other places, and brand name drugs, which means, well, they're going to be more expensive. Does that hold true in other areas of healthcare in terms of like healthcare services, how much we get tested, the kind of treatments we receive, the surgeries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
So in an international sense, it does seem to be true that generally the US is, or Americans are consuming higher technology or more intense forms of care. For example, MRI scans, stuff like organ transplants, like these procedures that are really what you think of as kind of cutting edge. It's not always clear that there are huge clinical improvements from doing them, but they are a lot more costly, and maybe on the margin, they're improving care just enough that it ends up being worth it. But it is generally true that the US is consuming higher quantities of care, especially when you factor in the intensity of that care. And there's actually, I think, good evidence for this within the US when you compare the care that people are getting in that market we were talking about earlier, the employer market, relative to Medicare. And so Medicare pays very similarly to what a lot of these other European countries would pay for services, whereas the employer market, it's a market. And so the prices tend to be a lot higher because they're set by these insurers, bargaining with these providers. And what you tend to find is that care in this market looks higher quality on average, or at the very least, the prices in this market seem to reflect high quality. So for example, if you look within local areas where Medicare's payments are basically constant across hospitals, what you see is that the hospitals that are getting paid the very most in the employer market with their commercial contracts, those hospitals are the ones that reduce mortality the most when people are close to randomly assigned to them to go to them for care. They also tend to have like the best trained physicians of all the hospitals in that local area. They also tend to just have the highest technology procedures. So they'll have a lot more MRI scans. They'll do a lot more like robotic surgeries. And so I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I would say that generally there is a sense in which we are consuming a lot more care, and there's a sense in which higher prices in the US in some of our more private markets do reflect that. I will just briefly note that that relationship seems to be true, but it's not the whole story, because there is also these markets that are very concentrated, where there are just very few hospitals within the local area. And in those places, it seems like we're getting higher prices for nothing.
Right. So there's a mixture of different explanations, right? Like, because we consume a lot of low value care, which probably inflates our healthcare costs. In other countries, they really try to take out that healthcare, which isn't doing very much and costing a lot. We consume sometimes better care, which is more expensive, but other countries would rule cost ineffective, right? It's just not worth the money. We consume a lot of tests. We get tested a lot. We have a lot of specialists in this country. We go to specialists for tons of stuff that people might not go to specialists for in other places. In other countries, they have more gatekeeping. So they try to send you to your primary care doctor more. We spend less time with our primary care doctor. They want to keep you out of the hospital. They want to keep you from going to specialists to reduce their costs. There are all these things where like we actually just are spending more for about the same because there isn't really competition. And because the government's not there, they're not regulating the prices. So you have sometimes huge price varieties for things like an MRI scan, which are not really explained by anything objective. So somebody there is just making some extra money, and maybe that's going to something, or maybe it's going distributed inefficiently, so it's really not going anywhere that's helpful to the society. We do have emergency care. Sometimes the prices get really extraordinary. And in concentrated markets, we see that the more concentrated your market is, the fewer hospitals there are around, even if they're all nonprofits. Guess what? Prices are higher. And that doesn't mean that things are actually better. So we do pay higher prices in some instances, and we could lower them without actually having some sort of negative consequences. The long and the short of it is, America spends more than other countries for some justified reasons. There's some benefit to them. And there are plenty of unjustified reasons.
Why was I link this? I feel like these guys agree with everything I say. What was the point? To make me feel better?
Pay people less if we could have more doctors. We could have lower administrative costs, and we could get rid of frivolous healthcare and frivolous rent seeking, where people are able to charge higher prices than they should be allowed to do so. Now, let's move on to the second thing that people always are talking about. We do not have universal healthcare coverage in this country, and every other developed country does. That's the claim. Is that true? And how big of a problem is that?
So I would say that this is technically true. As we talked about earlier, there is this whole segment of the US, about 10% of the population, that does not technically have insurance. I would say that this problem, though, is a little overstated because, as we talked about earlier, a lot of these people don't technically have insurance, but they do have access to a lot of this free and or reduced price care that is being funded on the back end in a really complicated system by state and federal governments. I would say they are kind of practically insured, even though they are not technically insured. And now I don't want to overstate my position too much. It's still a problem. And I think it's a problem because just because you have access to some care does not mean that's the best care you could have been getting or the best package of care that you could have been getting. So there's certainly arguments that these people would be better off if they were in a more formal insurance plan. So for example, there's evidence that Medicaid does reduce mortality for a lot of these people who were previously uninsured. Then more generally, just the fact that a lot of these people who end up uninsured are churning in and out of like the employer market. So they'll have their job one day, all of a sudden they're fired, they're uninsured, all they have is this uncompensated care that's subsidized. That creates a lot of anxiety for a lot of Americans. And it's just anxiety that you don't need at all. We could totally get rid of it and I think make people have a lot more peace of mind. What would you?
Right. So some people just don't seek care, period, because they don't know they have access to it. Even if technically you have access to something, doesn't mean that you actually know that. Like people don't know that you can go to the hospital and say, I can't afford to pay. And they're like, okay, well, we were going to charge you $4,000, but now we're not. Right? Like you ask the average poor person, they just don't know that. So they don't get the care that they should. Certainly not preventative care. Even if they do get healthcare, it's often on the back end, which is more expensive care and it is often worse because they already have the problem, their intestines bursting or whatever. We see that we have lack of preventative care for this demographic, which drags down a lot of healthcare indicators that are really healthcare specific. Where you're like, man, why is America so bad at maternal mortality or whatever? Actually, I think we're pretty good at that. But anything, and it's like, okay, actually, most people that get healthcare do great, but there's this whole cohort of the population which just doesn't get the care, or at least to the degree they should. Now, some people are just missed by the system, so they're poor and they get healthcare debt, like they just can't pay the bill. So it's a much less equitable way to pay for healthcare. In other countries, it's paid for by some sort of tax-based system. So even if they're paying like the same amount, it is distributed in a much more fair way. So there's not individuals that are just like hit with these massive bills, which destroy their lives. And I think this brings us to the big enchilada, which I think they're the biggest misconceptions are about, which is healthcare quality. And by that, I mean the actual impact that healthcare has on our life expectancy and our health indicators. Many people say, look, in America, we spend so much on healthcare, but our life expectancy is lower than other developed countries. Oh my God, our healthcare system is to blame. How much truth is there to that claim? And if it's not true, what are the things that explain why Americans live less long compared to other people?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think the pithiest way to explain it is that healthcare can only do so much. So in the US case, when people talk about us having such a low life expectancy relative to other countries, what you have to understand is that life expectancy is a measure that's really just mashing up a bunch of things that are not necessarily the fault of the insurance system and the providers. So for example, one reason why the US has very low life expectancy is because a lot more people here die in car crashes. Is that necessarily the fault of like our insurance system? To me, there's no way to see a really, I think, plausible direct link. And similarly, one reason we have a relatively low life expectancy is because we have a lot more homicides. Additionally, we'll have a lot more deaths from opioid overdoses, a lot of which can be related to cheap fentanyl supply from South American countries. And just you go down the line of all these things, and it's hard to say that it's really health that is overall driving our problems with life expectancy. But at the same time, there is a health component, and this is a health component that people seem to blame on the American healthcare system. And that health component is that Americans are just, culturally quite unhealthy. Like we eat pretty badly. We don't really exercise. I'm not saying Micah's like this, but most people are in the US like not very healthy compared to these other countries. And so I think when you go down the line, what you really the conclusion you should end up with is that discrepancy in life expectancy is either like very overstated in terms of the role that healthcare and our healthcare system has to play, or it's just completely explained by these other factors that are not really related. What would you add?
I mean, yeah, surely if we had universal rollout of the best preventative care, we could get higher life expectancy, especially with new miracle drugs like Ozempic, which would help solve our obesity problem, which is a huge contributor to our issues. And surely if we had the best treatments for everyone when they got a disease, we could expand their life expectancy. But there's also all these other factors which help explain part of the difference. And it's just not true that if let's say we impose the French healthcare system on America, now our life expectancy is that of France. Certainly, our life expectancy will not be that of Japan or South Korea or some of these Asian countries. You have to ask yourself, okay, well, Europe lives longer than us, but why do all these Asians live longer than Europe? Well, a lot of it's lifestyle, right? Like, it's not just that Japan figured out some miracle healthcare system that is just, or Taiwan is magically better than Europe. It's just that there's like a lot of lifestyle factors, which we should try to address. Those are actually often free or really cheap to address, but don't put everything on healthcare because healthcare can only do so much. A lot of what healthcare is about is your quality of life while you're alive, right? Like if you have a chronic condition, having access to high quality treatments helps a lot. And not as much, certainly it has an impact on how long you live. With that said, I think we've addressed a lot of the big pervasive notions about healthcare. What you see is, a lot of them are true, but they miss a lot of nuances and maybe over-exaggerate their claims. But we definitely do agree that American healthcare should be dramatically better. And that's why we want to move on to some of the problems that we believe the American healthcare system has that people don't talk about all that much. The first one I think we should talk about is the lock-in effect. The lock-in effect comes from employer-provided insurance. As we said earlier, over half of people, just about half of people, get their health insurance from their employer. And what does that mean? Well, if your health insurance is tied to your employer, what happens when you leave your employer? Oh, you lose your health insurance, right? And well, that means that you don't really want to leave your employer so much, especially if you're sick, especially if you have a chronic condition, because there's this danger. You can't afford to go search for a job in the intermediary period because you don't have health insurance. Or you're just scared of the transition between one employer to another employer. You're going to lose your physician. You're going to lose access to the medications that you rely on or your family relies on because your family's often on your plan. This adds frictions in the employment market. And do these frictions actually have a large negative impact?
I think it's one of those things that's hard to test. Sure. But if you think just like intuitively, losing your health insurance is something that nobody really wants to happen. And so it would make sense that people on the margin are going to be worried about this. And one kind of interesting thing that you kind of alluded to is that because you lose your insurance when you leave your employer, one thing that this could exacerbate is competition for workers. So if you think about it, like you get a job offer from, or you think there might be a job offer out there from a better company, and you want to spend time actually looking for it. In the US system, for most people, you have to give up your health insurance to be able to go do that. And so even if there's this better company over here who's willing to pay you a lot more, you might not be willing to take that risk because you have to spend this time uninsured. Maybe you can't exactly get a plan in the individual market on like the Obamacare exchanges. You don't want to deal with that system of uncompensated care. So that's really, I think, the crux of the issue is that it hurts one of the greatest things, which is that companies can compete for workers and the best companies can attract them over time through higher wages.
Right.
Would you add anything?
This has real macroeconomic effects, right? Because if employers really have this power over you, they can treat you worse, they can pay you worse. You don't go to the most productive job opportunity, which means you make less, your quality of life is worse, and the government takes less in taxes. So there's this actual negative social impact from this effect, the lock-in effect. And it's a big problem. And that's why pretty much amongst healthcare nerds, everyone agrees that we should just not rely on employer-provided insurance so much. That's one of the areas of American exceptionalism. Almost no one in the world really relies on employer-provided insurance as much as we do. And so everyone just disagrees about what we should replace it with, but few people actually are huge fans of the system other than the lobbyists for the employers themselves, which happen to be really big fans.
So the next problem that is really important to discuss is that we are not maximizing our innovative potential in the United States. And so a great example of this, really economy-wide, but it also applies very much in the healthcare sector, is the problem of frivolous patenting. And so patents are a huge component of how companies here develop drugs and devices. They're going to invest a bunch up front. They're going to then get approval for it. They're going to patent it, and then they're going to sell it as a monopolist for a while. And the idea is that period of being a monopolist is when they can, again, like we mentioned earlier, recover all those upfront costs and all the failures along the way. Now, the problem is that patenting is pretty cheap in a sense because you can patent a lot of things that you don't even necessarily use or that are only marginal improvements on existing treatments. And so what this means is if I'm a company who has this blockbuster drug, for example, and I want to patent everything under the sun that's like even close to it, so I know I won't have another competitor. And this is the worst part, I won't even use those other patents that I've already just gotten, and I'll just sit on them. Then I can sell as a monopolist. This will then slow, obviously, competition in the market, but also progress. So other companies might want to come in and use my patent to develop, an improvement along the way. And so just really in all different facets, price, future innovation, this is a really big problem. What would you add to that?
Yeah, right. So you have these frivolous copycat patents, which we should crack down on so that you actually, people are only investing in actual innovation, not researching things that are monopolizing things that are unhelpful. There's also the FDA, which goes really slow. Sometimes it applies too high of standards. We don't approve drugs that are approved in Canada automatically. There's inefficiencies there, which raise costs and slow down innovation. I think that this brings us to another issue, which almost very rarely is talked about, which is the lack of price competition in America, or just competition amongst healthcare providers anyway. People don't shop for healthcare, especially even shoppable services. If you need to go to an emergency room, you can't really shop for that, right? You're gonna go to the nearest hospital. But if you need surgery, well, you actually can shop for that. If you need to go see a specialist, you can shop for that. It's not urgent. And there's not really a mechanism to do so because you're not really paying, you're not really exposed to the price. Often you're locked into a network where everything's pre-negotiated. There's not transparency in the prices or ways to judge different types of doctors in the ways that there could be. And we've seen many countries like Singapore, where there is a lot more transparency in price competition, and in plastic surgery in the United States, where there is a lot more of the presence of actual competition and you're paying, prices get lower. They find more productive ways to do things. Well, because there's an incentive to do so. And so something that we could do in the United States is try to inject more price competition where it's feasible.
And so there's kind of two perspectives on this of how you can get more price competition. One is actually thinking about, with our existing system of insurance, what can insurers do to make...
Yeah, I was going to say, technically, theoretically, you shouldn't need individuals to shop for price. Theoretically, this should be a function of the insurance market. Theoretically, the insurance company should be able to shop for price more efficiently than an insured individual should, because they should have more information about the market. Now, in effect, what this looks like, I'm not entirely sure. You'd rely on competition between insurers, and I don't know how that would actually play out in effect. But
consumers more price sensitive. And so one way that a lot of insurers have been experimenting with is something called reference pricing. Micah obviously loves this, but the gist of what happens is the insurer will give people price information. So let's say on MRIs, that would be kind of the canonical shoppable service. They'll give them price information and they'll say, yeah, we're going to pay you this lump sum, which is equal to like the median price. If you find anything that's cheaper than the median price and you go to that instead, we'll let you keep the entire rest of the money that you save. And so
There's variations of this idea, but the idea is pretty simple, right? You have an incentive to consume something cheaper because you actually receive some of the savings for doing so.
Sure.
Yeah. And so that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it that's also being used recently is for plans that don't even want to give consumers price information. They're like, oh, these consumers, they're not going to look at the prices and compare it to the co-insurance rate and whatever. What they'll just do is they'll say, hey, we have 3 types of copays. We got $100, to $150, and like $50. And if you go to this hospital, it's a tier 1 copay, so you pay $50. If you go to this one, it's $100. And the idea with that is to give consumers really clear prices where they don't have to do a bunch of work on their part, and they can just really see what these differences are and make hopefully cost effective.
If you do actual research, you'll find the biggest cost of healthcare. These guys haven't addressed it yet. Destiny hasn't either. What's the biggest cost? Your mom? Would you ever do a disagreement day where people call into a different number or Discord, like, or with disagreements like the amazing Lucas does? Maybe.
Choices.
We'll see.
And what you see is that when you do that,
I think I can be done with this game in 2 days. I think tomorrow. We'll see.
you're able to get people to shop for things like inpatient services. So I know there's a paper on like colonoscopies, and there's also papers on just like more comprehensive inpatient surgery, so like knee replacements, that was able to get people to shop. And this is like really surprising to a lot of healthcare economists because they're like, people don't shop really for their knee replacement or whatever, but it does seem to actually be effective at doing that. So that's one way to do it, is through the insurers.
If you can inject more price competition, that means that now these providers are going to have an incentive to make things cheaper. So that means if there's a new technology and automation or anything they can do to reduce the cost, they're going to have at least some incentive to do so. Now, quality also matters. And so there is evidence to indicate from plastic surgery and foreign experience, and actually experience with these exact ideas in the United States, that this can reduce costs and potentially promote cost-saving innovation, commercialization amongst healthcare providers, because now they really gotta put up or go home, because if they don't implement the cost savings, well, no one's going to go get their knee replacements or whatever. And this brings us to the last problem.
Wait! Let me use the restroom. Or wait, I can turn the speaker on. 1 second.
That we talk about, which nobody else seems to care about, because you're you're on the stump about this all the time. Private insurers don't have the best incentives, but that doesn't mean they couldn't.
That's exactly right, Micah. And to explain why they don't have great incentives, what you need to start with is just 2 things that are endemic to the US insurance system. And the first one is that people's insurance contracts are relatively short in the US. In places like the Affordable Care Act exchanges, it's just 1 year. It's the same in the Medicare program for Medicare Advantage plans. In the employer market, even when you think people are going to spend some time in their plan because they're at their job, I think the average stay is like 3 to 5 years. So if you think about what the incentives are as an insurer, they are kind of to skimp on you as much as possible, because they don't actually need to pay the costs or the higher costs that come down the line as your health deteriorates. So for example, if Micah is trying to get treatment for diabetes that is especially cost effective, but I just deny it now, and I know he's going to be on a different insurer down the line, there's no real penalty on somebody like me to stop that from happening. And so an idea to fix this, or really 2 ideas to fix this, are 1, to get people onto longer insurance plans where we think the insurer is more likely to internalize these bad health outcomes that come from skimping on coverage. And then additionally, we think another important thing is to bundle health insurance with life insurance. So for people who don't know, life insurance is essentially just the insurer will pay you if you die. And often people will get it because they're trying to protect their family from their death and the financial consequences of it. But there's no reason we couldn't just generally bundle a life insurance benefit, like a really kind of bare bones life insurance benefit, with our health insurance. And what you could really think about this as is, it's this penalty that insurers have to pay if they do kind of the most severe thing of all, which is lead you to die under their supervision. And so we think that if we were able to get people into longer term contracts where the insurers are also liable for your life, that they would have much stronger incentives to invest in high quality care, to get you the preventative stuff that you need early, to make sure that, let's say they're using a reference pricing tool, to make sure you're not just going to super cheap, low quality hospitals, but making sure you're going to ones that are low cost and relatively high quality.
Right.
So there's all these good incentives that can come.
It's a really simple idea that what's profit maximizing for the insurer should be also the thing that's best for you. Right? There's this claim that goes around all the time, and it's largely true, which is every time they deny a claim, that is something that has some profits, right? They only can make money by denying your claims. Well, I mean, obviously they have to deny some claims if they're spurious, but now actually denying every claim is not profit maximizing, certainly, because there's certain claims that are necessary for your health. And if you die...
Well, and also there's, for some regulated plans, your premiums have to be a percentage of your, the payouts have to be a percentage of the total premiums you make. Insurance companies don't make money denying claims. They make money collecting premiums. That's what insurance companies are in the business of doing. So they collect premiums, they do the calculations for payouts, and then the payouts are less than some percentage of all the premiums they collect. This is how insurance makes money.
Die, well, guess what? They're going to get charged for that. And the earlier you die, the more they got to pay. It's a very simple idea that, if you die earlier, they're going to pay more. And the later you die, the less they're going to pay. And if you actually end up living a pretty decent quality of life for yourself, well, they don't have to pay very much at all, right? They don't have to pay anything at a certain point. And so it's longer term exposure. Now, some people think that private insurance just will never have good incentives. One of the arguments they bring up is that whenever you do experiments on people's choices amongst private insurers, you see that often they choose private insurance plans which aren't the best. So what they'll do is they'll create a curated sample of like 25 private insurance options, and they'll write out the details of all of them, and they give it to test takers, right? And they say, which one would you choose? And they find that often people choose dominated plans. Those are plans that are just inferior, straight up, across all domains to other options that people were afforded. And the idea is that shopping between insurers is just really complicated. So even if you simplify the different axes of difference amongst them, people are still too lazy to actually take the time to find the optimal plan. And so, well, if people are not actually rewarding the best insurers for being the best and are just choosing kind of randomly, well, then why would we think that private insurers would actually have an incentive to do a really good job? King of the Coast disagrees with this idea. So what is your argument against that?
You say people are lazy, but also it's just like you're talking about like picking, for one, the plans are usually, it's kind of complicated to look between them. And two, you're talking about like very low probability events. Like nobody really, I think, has in their mind, like how likely is it for me to experience like this catastrophic health thing? It's just not a thing that we commonly deal with.
It's that point.
So before I get to where I disagree, I'll say where I agree. And I 100% agree that choice in health insurance markets is imperfect. Consumers often make mistakes. And I think crucially what people need to understand is that these studies that a lot of people are citing, they're studies of consumers when presented with a menu of options. And they're looking at whether the consumer is essentially picking the very best option for them. Not a relatively good option, not like way better than a random option, the very best option for them. And that is definitely telling you something. I'm not saying it's not telling you anything, but it's also, if you think about it, just an extremely high bar to evaluate competition on. And so the better metric, in my view, is to look at whether consumers have a high preference, for example, for lower premium plans, for conditional on the premium, high quality plans, for, in general, do consumers seek out higher quality plans? Do they seek out lower cost plans? And this does seem to be something that happens. It could be a lot better than it is right now, but it does seem to be something that happens. And I think a good analogy here, if I could really quickly, is to think about like what people would say in other markets. So
after the Supreme Court shot down deporting Venezuelans, a lot of big conservative voices on X are calling for Trump to declare martial law and arrest all the Democrats and the court. What are the odds this happens? I feel like the Trump admin is trying to avoid like direct confrontations where they're obviously in the wrong. So I feel like that wouldn't happen, but I don't know. Who knows? We'll see.
for example, if I told you that people do not always go to the lowest priced gas station in their area, but over time, people tend to flow to the lowest priced gas station as they hear about it from their friends, they look it up every now and then, right? If over time the market is moving towards lower cost or higher quality providers, then it doesn't actually matter that it's not perfect. There's still a lot of value from the competition. So what we
Heart attacks and strokes are very common. Depends on what you mean by catastrophic event. No, heart attacks and strokes are not very common. I don't know what the fuck you possibly mean by that. How many people do you know that are commonly having heart attacks or strokes? The average person probably has one or fewer, would be my guess. Like, what?
And I think that's a reasonable take. It just depends on how bad people's decisions are, and how much these bad insurers end up going away. I think that there's also a good argument that you can add more decision-making aids to the process. One idea that you've advocated for in the past is risk-weighted mortality scores. So basically, you look at the type of people that your insurance is taking, and you're seeing how good are you doing for these people relative to their health, right? So if you take all very sick people that are very poor, and you manage to actually, the people on your plan live longer than they would be expected to live on average, well, you're doing a great job, right? If you take all really rich people, and they're very healthy, and they end up dying 3 years earlier, well, you're doing a pretty bad job, right? And you can have some sort of metrics for that, things like that, which are displayed on the insurance marketplace, which will make it really simple to choose. You just say, hey, let me look at the cost, and you can simplify the differences in cost. And you say, let me look at how good they are at actually keeping people alive. And maybe there's a few other variables, and now it's actually really easy not to choose the worst ones, right? Like, maybe it's still kind of complicated to choose the best one, but at least that the bad ones are bad, and as the bad ones die off, well, then there's a higher bar for what the bad ones are, and those die off, and those die off over and over and over again, and eventually you get a better working system. Now, another point that you make to articulate why private insurers might be better than just a government health insurance program is that they do this thing called managed care. Can you explain what managed care is and why it could be useful?
Yeah, so managed care is really kind of a euphemism, but what it essentially means is you're steering people from certain types of care to other types of care. And in the best of worlds, what is happening is that insurers are steering people from high cost care to low cost care, and from high or low quality care to high quality care. One of the really essential ways that insurers do this is through their provider networks. So some insurers, actually most insurers at this point, will only contract with some providers. And the idea is that the insurers go to bargain with the providers. They say, yeah, if you don't give me a great price, if you don't give me this much quality in exchange for your price, I'm not going to include you in the plan. And then if you're a consumer in that plan, you're not going to want to go to the people who are out of network and don't give you coverage. So that's one way in which they can really manage care. Now, it's important to understand that we want insurers to come up with ways to do this that aren't a huge hassle to consumers. So there are obviously instances in which something like networks can be a hassle to navigate. And so the argument is we want insurers finding ways to manage care without creating that big hassle. And in its ideal world, pushing people towards low cost, high quality care.
That's very helpful. No, I understand the real debate is, does the managed care just make things more complicated and inflate their profits, or does it actually add some significant value where there's a bunch of cost savings. At least in the example of Medicare Advantage plans make plenty of profits, but they also offer more coverage than Medicare, and they do it for close to the same amount of money. There's some gaming and fraud, and so you can see, well, they are actually able to cover some more stuff and maybe have a little bit lower cost sharing because they're doing this. So there are some real savings here. This brings us to the very last section of this video, which is going to be the briefest, which is outlining the different types of healthcare systems which exist in the world. There's basically 3 types of universal healthcare systems which exist in developed countries: socialized medicine, single payer, and managed competition. We're going to put up a map here for you so you can see a map of the world that I created, which shows you the different systems in play. Essentially, these managed competition systems are more on the market-based side. There's different variations of them. Probably King of the Coast would advocate for his own unique wonky version. But the idea here is that this competition amongst providers and insurers actually adds some value. And so we want to use market forces to make sure we have universal healthcare, but also we have like a dynamic, innovative system. And then
Imagine H3 sued Hassan and donated all of Hassan's money to Palestine. I don't think they could sue him for anything, but
there's single payer and socialized medicine, which are more common. And the idea here is ultimately private sector in healthcare just not worth the complexity. The government can do it more efficiently, and they can take care of the innovation and be dynamic in the ways that we need them to be. This is the big debate. We're not going to settle in this video because that would take forever. But do you have any closing thoughts on this debate that you think that our viewers will find valuable to aid them in this long, lengthy healthcare research process?
Yeah, so all I would add to what you just said is that there are also kind of hybrids of the two. So you have socialized medicine and single payer on one hand, and then you have managed competition on the other hand. But there are also systems that kind of merge these two. So Australia is a great example of this. This is called like a 2-tier system. But Australia basically has socialized medicine. So they own the providers. And then on the other hand, they also have a system of private insurance and private providers. The main argument that people make for this is that it can give people who are willing to pay for it access to like more timely care. They can be seen faster. They can maybe get higher quality care that the more social system wouldn't cover. The only thing I would also add is that there are 2-tier systems that mix kind of managed competition with a really like relatively unregulated private market. And so Germany is the biggest example of this. They have a managed competition system pretty similar to Obamacare. It's more restrictive in a lot of ways, but then high income people can also opt out and go into these like lifelong private insurance contracts that are risk rated. That's a whole different.
It's very complicated, right? Like what happens is a lot of these countries have the public system, but it's like not funded well enough, and there's really long wait times, and so people start opting out into the private system. And the argument is, well, we don't really actually want to make the public healthcare system better because that's really expensive, and now it's like just a social safety net for lower income people. And hey, if you want to get private insurance, you go to private doctors, that's fine. It's kind of a fragmented system, and there's certainly inefficiencies. I don't think that anybody would go into developing a healthcare system wanting it to be 2-tier because it just doesn't make a ton of sense. Like you could still have a system that has a social safety net, and it's all one unified system where people can pay more and get more without having to go through an entirely different system. But hey, that's on the map. You guys can see it, and it is certainly interesting. I know in countries like Canada, the whole debate is should we become 2-tier or not. Now you'll understand American healthcare, how it works, what are its problems, both the myths about them and the actual real problems, and the different kinds of universal healthcare systems which exist around the world. I've made a lot of other healthcare content on this channel.
Do we all understand?
I will make future videos on healthcare, maybe with King of the Coast, so we can dive more into what kind of solutions we think we should be prioritizing. But I hope you found this video helpful. Make sure to share it with any of your friends which are trying to become healthcare wonks, and make sure to subscribe. King of the Coast, do you have any social media handles you want to plug before we close this off?
Yeah, just my Twitter account, which is King of the Coast with TTs at the end. But other than that, this was great.
Right, one of the wonkiest healthcare videos on the internet. We're gonna take in the cake. Healthcare triage. We're coming for you. We're getting even nerdier than you are. Thank you guys. I will see you in the next video.
Does anyone else nerd out? Any other